Due to the Nakatomi Corporation's legacy of greed around the globe, they are about to be taught a lesson in the real use of power. You will be witnesses.
Power has been with humanity in many different forms since the dawn of time, and will be with us for generations to come. We can often intuitively recognize differences in power in the world around us, but at the same time, it is not always easy to explain how or why. That doesn't stop people from trying, of course. It is often regarded as something good to have.
Thank you for your support. Votes for women. Ladies, votes for women. The power is in your hands.
Or some enduring negative force.
Just quit. Because in this life, you can't win. Yeah, you can try. But in the end, you're just gonna lose big time because the world is run by the man. And the man ruined the ozone, and he's burning down the Amazon, and he kidnapped Shamu and put her in a chlorine tank, okay? So don't waste your time trying to make anything cool or pure or awesome, because the man's just gonna call you a fat, washed-up loser and crush your soul. So do yourselves a favor and just give up!
But both views ignore a lot of aspects of power. I was thinking about how it works while watching the first season of Altered Carbon a while ago, and realized there were quite a few interesting insights woven to the story. Altered Carbon is a futuristic saga about the exploits of Takashi Kovacs through different phases of his life. He once was hopeful and idealistic, but developed a cynical worldview after a lifetime of betrayal and loss.
Peace is an illusion, no matter how tranquil the world seems. Peace doesn't last long.
His part in a dangerous rebellion landed him in some sort of mind prison for several centuries. Now he re-enters a world that has long since moved on with a skill set that has basically turned into myth, which makes him an interesting pawn to the rich and powerful.
I give you Takeshi Kovacs.
Stories have always been a great way to explore concepts that are challenging to express concisely with words, like love, growing up, or indeed power. While watching or reading about unfolding events, there is also the opportunity to examine a situation from multiple perspectives.
You don't believe we went to the moon?
I believe it was a brilliant piece of propaganda that the Soviets bankrupted themselves, pouring resources into rockets and other useless machines.
Pose interesting questions.
Guys, what would you wish you'd done before you died?
Paint a self-portrait.
Build a house. And you?
And show how persons can differ from each other. And Altered Carbon specifically matches the topic of power very well. So I thought it would be fun to create a musing out of power using scenes from the show as illustration. Before we begin, I want to make a couple of quick remarks. Although I don't go into the plot that much, the musing probably deserves a spoiler warning. So if you haven't seen the first season of Altered Carbon already, you might want to watch it first. You don't need to have seen it to follow the musing, but you might miss a couple of references, and I highly recommend Altered Carbon to anyone who likes science fiction anyway. And if you did enjoy the musing, maybe you can watch the series again later through a new lens, or watch it with friends while discussing the topic every once in a while. By the way, if you like the musing, I'd really appreciate it if you could recommend it to a friend who might like it too. Since this is my first video, YouTube doesn't really know this channel exists yet. But with that out of the way, let's jump in. With the rise of new communication tools, humanity started to inhabit one interconnected world, creating an arena of competing nations, multinationals, and other forces that many feel too small to change. But as reality has so many layers, it is also easy to overlook things that can motivate, console and inspire us. Using popular media as inspiration, this channel will dive deep into loaded or depressing topics to find fresh perspectives and interesting questions. The world is built on shared assumptions. If enough people are willing to question them, play around with them and keep those that work, we may very well find new ways forward. And have good time together along the way. This is Guided Musings.
Money? Power is an illusion. It's up here.
At the beginning of Altered Carbon, the show creates the impression that it is simply better to be powerful. Those without it often just have to take what is offered to them, without the ability to really barter or make waves. And those with it have their requests taken seriously and are much more likely to get what they want. Even if they could take something by force, they rarely seem to need to. They move to the front of the line and exceptions are made for them. But as the story moves forward and we get up close and personal with some tremendously powerful persons, it shows that power might not be as desirable as it seems. To understand why, we need to understand how power, the ability to get people to do what you want regardless of their own desires, really works. So that's where we will start. We will follow it up with transfer power, and then we will discuss the downsides of it. Finally, we will contrast power with 3 alternative strategies. So how does power work? Although it gets more complicated once you start thinking about the mechanics, at its core, power revolves around the ability to cause harm. So Altered Carbon provides many examples of the connection between power and the capacity to harm. For example, it is when someone would have the upper hand in combat that he can make demands. On the other hand, when someone who would obviously lose in a violent conflict is making demands, the situation is treated like a joke.
No, don't go in there. Come on! No!
The fact that this is treated like a funny situation is an indication the writers trust we as an audience have internalized this relationship between harm and power too, at least subconsciously. The connection between power and harm holds true for any aspiring entity, whether it is an individual, organization, or nation. A state can use its personnel to punish a crime lord who refuses to pay his taxes, or arrest a criminal who is acting against it. Even though the state imposes laws against the use of violence, this doesn't stop all of its inhabitants and organizations from using harm to coerce compliance, especially when both parties act outside of the law regularly. An organization might have a security force, and an individual can take up a weapon himself. To further drive home the connection between harm and compliance, Altered Carbon gives a lot of attention to torture. A lot. And it makes sense. The one who is tortured can't escape and is literally harmed until he does what the torturer wants. So torture tends to hold a lot of power over the tortured. It was only when making this musing I realized how central the theme of torture was to the story. I may even have left 1 or 2 torture scenes out here. On the other hand, reducing the ability to harm is also shown to reduce the ability to hold power over others too. The upper class meths are all effectively immortal, have their own security force, and are incredibly wealthy.
It's a myth.
The days of Methuselah were 969 years. It's Lawrence Bancroft. He's over 360 years old.
This means that their ability to harm each other is limited, and so is the power they may hold over each other.
Everyone's hated Lawrence, but 100 years pass and you realize there's just no upside. We are all going to go through the rest of humanity's future stuck together.
This is why Altered Carbon is such a good backdrop to muse about power, since many characters in the first season are able to harm each other in a wide variety of settings. Power plays a far more important role in Altered Carbon than it usually does in my own life and hopefully in yours too. During an uprising, causing harm is a primary tool for all parties involved, of course. But even when the story moves to a more peaceful era, the main character Kovac navigates the areas in this society where government has the least control and people are most likely to take the law into their own hands. Ironically, this involves both the slums and the upper class area. They just have a very different flavor. Most people, who just seem to get on with their lives, are often given no more than a sidelong glance by the show as the series' main character rushes by, guns blazing.
And which truth is that?
Knowledge is power.
Harm does not always involve physical violence, however. Altered Carbon shows clearly humans are fully capable of harming one another without it.
I am going to ruin you. Your access to Arium is withdrawn. Your license to practice law will be revoked. No meth will ever hire you. And everything you own will be confiscated.
In fact, there's a wide variety of non-physical harm we humans can use to threaten each other with, like planting false evidence against someone, blackmailing someone, using compromising footage, spreading a false story, or exposing someone's lies. These methods may not involve physical violence, but it can still be used to forcefully achieve one's aim. Even entities, which are sometimes thought of as powerless, can definitely hold power over others. There have always been bullies among children, for example, but the advent of social media and sexting have also created new ways to seriously harm each other without having to resort to physical violence. This in turn facilitates the formation of power dynamics among children. And when a youngster witnesses an adult breaking the law or doing something inadvisable, the balance of power might shift between them two. But regardless of whether we talk about physical or non-physical harm, the question remains who can hurt the other more.
Cut his throat. Stop. Wait. I've changed my mind. Let him go. Step back 3 paces. Power is power.
This doesn't mean a weaker opponent will always back down from conflict and comply, nor will you always lose. History is filled with examples of weaker armies winning. It generally requires more efficient use of its resources and manpower, and thus superior strategy or tactics. Like surprising the opponent, attacking when the opponent is divided or split, fighting a hit-and-run war when open conflict would probably end in disaster, or attacking a weak spot. Even the most dangerous entities are not without some weak spots that might be exploited. And when you hit those, you can cause some serious damage, regardless of the difference in strength.
We find the weakness, and then we strike.
Some places on our body simply hurt way more than others. The show shows plenty of other weak spots that can be exploited. Having far more resources can sometimes be a weakness in itself too, as it can breed overconfidence and complacency. But it works both ways. Pressing the weak spots of your enemies and using the element of surprise reduces the need for additional resources for the powerful as well. Strategy and tactics just amplify the capacity to harm on both sides. So when a significantly stronger foe is well prepared for open conflict, it may be difficult to best him. In those cases, unless we see a clear weak point to pressure, we generally give in and wait for a better opportunity to strike back. There are of course the exceptions that prove the rule. For example, when an unhappy mob starts rioting. But generally speaking, We take the odds into account before resorting to violence, even when we're not happy with the situation. This applies from playground politics all the way up to international events.
If we wanted, we could smash them to bits. Although if we did, we'd have to consider what would happen to our lights, our heat, our air.
So far, we talked a lot about harm. This is not to say that those who do aim for power don't use other means too. In many cases, the easiest way to get others to do something they wouldn't ordinarily do is to just pay them for it.
Most kills, most days off, most bonus money.
And even in those cases you would be willing to resort to harm, letting someone choose between the carrot or the stick could be more effective in the long run. There's a resource cost to causing harm, apart from the more solid consequences we will muse about later. Especially open conflict, where both sides try to hurt each other, can be very risky and very expensive. But even one-sided violence isn't free. Resources are never unlimited, and the benefits have to be weighed against the cost. In fact, those who desire power have to walk a delicate balance between maintaining their resources, and thus their ability to harm, and maintaining their image of danger. If you shoot the last bullet inside your gun, you lose all leverage. But if others realize you're not going to shoot, you might as well have no gun at all. So it can often be advantageous for the powerful to avoid conflict too. However, the most important part is that those who desire to hold power over others don't shy away from using harm to get others to do what they want when it is their most effective option.
Don't you touch him.
But because conflict isn't free and without risk for either side, we see a lot of posturing and characters threatening each other without actually causing harm, especially when there's no clear hierarchy between them. As power works on different scales, can be lied about, and depends for a large part on image, it isn't always clear who is the most powerful. The transfer of power to others, which we will discuss next, complicates things further. But as proving your capacity to harm is without cost, in many of the more unclear situations, we often see some sort of posturing. This can be done in a way that's either implicit or very explicit. Implicit threats might, for example, take the shape of advice or encouragement, while explicit threats are more, well, explicit, and describe in which way the other would be harmed. Even during torture, in which harm is already actively being caused, threats are made about near future harm, to make the other give in sooner.
Vicky, exit Becky. Or gas in a blowtorch. Come see, come ça.
Threatening someone in an explicit way may seem like aggressive behavior, but if it would convince the target it's not worth the risk, it actually prevents violence. When someone receives a threat, he has to assess which side has a superior ability to cause harm, and thus whether or not the threat can be ignored. So to those aiming to hold power over others, being seen as the biggest threat of all is very valuable. It will be much easier and cheaper to persuade others to do what you want, while decreasing the chance of having to resort to actual violence and incur its cost, which could lower his ability to cause harm.
Power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on the wall.
If you look at it this way, power is largely based on how dangerous others think someone is. And threats, boasts, and torture are ways to affect this. How someone looks also affects this assessment. Altered carbon sketches a certain image of the powerful, an aesthetic that complements the threats of harm and makes them more believable. This look changes over time, of course, and in other cultures and subcultures, there might be different signifiers for power, and differs for whether you talk about a country or a person. This show focuses primarily on the individual upper-class maps, but wherever you are, there are signifiers for powerful nations and organizations too, like military parades, testing advanced weapons, monuments, or a well-kept capital city. Part of the maps' aesthetic is obviously in how they dress, but it is also in their displays of wealth, which are a reflection of their ability to either bestow riches on someone or hurt them dearly, and in the way they act, especially when pressured. When you are effectively immortal, it probably does affect how you feel about death threats. The Mav Bancroft makes the interesting point that age is an important part of this aesthetic too. He could have chosen to take a younger clone, but he doesn't.
The young man sees himself as a fighting and fucking machine, huh? No, but the truth is, it's at this age that a man achieves real respect. Oh, he has battled many times, and clearly triumphed. Who? Who are the most potent gods after all, huh? Odin, Jupiter, Zeus.
Considering the value of being perceived as dangerous, some people try to emulate this Mav aesthetic, even though there are no Mavs themselves yet.
Still want to be one of them?
I have what it takes.
To summarize what we've discussed so far, the perceived superior ability to cause harm and the perceived willingness to do so are the cornerstones of power.
All of Rome have been laughing at him. They weren't so afraid of his Praetorian.
Fear and wonder. Powerful combination.
You really think that people are going to be seduced by that?
I think he knows what Rome is. Rome is the mob.
This brings us to transferred power. Because not all power and resources we wield are necessarily our own. Someone may not have a lot of personal power, but work for a person, organization, or nation with a tremendous ability to cause harm. When the son of a very powerful person asks,
"Do you understand who I am?"
he refers to his father's power, and a police officer derives his authority from the nation he works for. The reason why the main character's torturers were terrified to hear he was a military officer is because it means they basically crossed the interplanetary nation and its most elite unit and might incur their wrath. To communicate this, those who wield transferred power generally wear outfits and accessories which display their allegiance. Police or military uniforms are a rather obvious example, but it could conceivably be anything that is easily recognizable, like matching colors, a shared accessory or tattoo, or just general clothing style. Of course, if you wield power that does not belong to you, it generally comes with rules and limitations. You may be restricted in who you are allowed to harm, under what conditions, how much evidence is required, and how much resources you are allowed to use. Resources are never unlimited, and however big the amount of transferred power and the capacity to harm is, choices have to be made about how it is and isn't used. Those limitations may reduce the effectiveness of those who use transferred power quite a bit. That's why some organizations allow a certain amount of disregard towards their own rules in favor of effectiveness, especially if the rules officially demand lengthy or inefficient procedures. But there are limits, and those who misuse transferred power risk being punished themselves.
I'll give you 15 minutes. If you're not gone by then, I'll have you escorted out.
But whether it is transferred or your own, in the end, the capacity to harm is used to get others to do what you want.
I've always said that power is more important than money. But when it comes to elections, money gives power, well, a run for its money.
We talked earlier about the more solid costs of power. Especially when power is your own, it comes with 4 fundamental downsides. Control is an illusion. It fosters resentment. It can be bad for your relationships. And the dehumanification of others and self. The first is that, no matter how much power a person, organization or nation has, someone never completely controls the behavior of others. It may appear you have enough leverage over another to make demands, but you never know when this may backfire. We all make our own choices. And some things matter too much to us not to take a stand. Even when we maybe hurt ourselves. Even to the point of risking our lives. Some things are too evil to us not to fight them. And we can't turn a blind eye anymore. As humans, when we are pressured to act against our most important values, we can try to tell ourselves we had no choice. But in the end, we always know we did and resentment builds. Therefore, the notion that the environment can be fully controlled is never more than an elaborate illusion. To what extent do we even completely control our own behavior? What a digression. Because of this, even the most powerful can be betrayed. Ultimately, the rich and powerful bankrupt stands alone, despite his attempts to personify power. But also the galaxy-spanning protectorate is betrayed by one of their elite units, who shared sensitive information about vital weak spots to the uprising. This would have been the protectorate's undoing had there also not been a defector within the ranks of the uprising too, allowing the protectorate to strike first. The second disadvantage is that the use of coercion and harm fosters resentment and provokes violence, which acts as a hidden cost. It's why the main character murdered his father, and why the main character himself is being shot at when he's interrogating someone's friend violently. Even if violence seems to be used for noble reasons, someone else might see this as an unwarranted aggression.
It was taken from you, blood is owed.
It is always easy for us humans to convince ourselves the other is at fault, or that the harm we cause in return is justified. If you look at it this way, there's also a remarkable lack of harm and conflict going on in the series, and in the world in general. The main character might think,
peace is a struggle against our very nature.
But most of the time, a large portion of people, groups and nations are not in open conflict, even if they don't like each other. Still, this doesn't mean the oppressed aren't biding their time and waiting for a more potent opportunity to reassert themselves.
I can't believe it. They killed him because he wanted to change things. In our time.
They've been doing it
in
all
our
through
country.
history. Kings are killed, Mr. Garrison. Politics is power, nothing more.
The third cost of power is that it tends to harm your relationships. As humans, we have an innate desire to connect with others, to see and be seen by our peers and loved ones. A need for connection. And using harm to get your way, or at least the threat of it, obviously damages the trust between you and others.
If my father dies, like real death dies, family gets nothing. It's written into his will. So, if I killed him, I'd be penniless. And I do not do penniless.
In addition, from the perspective of power, having others you connect with is a weakness. A pressure point that might be exploited. Those you love, those you trust can be threatened, hurt, or even killed in an attempt to hurt or pressure you. It is why the Marines hide their identity and hostages tend to give so much leverage. To become very powerful, you may have to hide or defend your loved ones, which also soaks up valuable resources. And when someone you do trust betrays or intentionally tries to harm you, they can often harm you most, because they are familiar with your weaknesses and you are to some extent dependent on them. This is true on every level, from 2 persons to multitudes of nations. So looking for power creates a natural and continuous incentive to limit the pool of others you trust. Finally, Altered Carbon also underscores a rather subtle cost of power, which is a far cry from the classic violence begets violence. Power, and what's relevant to it, exists on a completely different level from that of ordinary human experience.
These people you've become so attached to. To me, they're fireflies, each a tiny spark whose beauty lies in how quickly it's extinguished.
The more we think in terms of harm and resources, the less we see others as human. We stop experiencing them as people with lives of their own, but just start to see them as means to an end, a resource to be exploited, or a threat that has to be contained. And in doing so, we may not only dehumanize others, but also lose touch with our own humanity, making it easy to hurt others and starve ourselves of real connection and fulfillment. As the main character says,
she'll lose her backups, money, power. Wake up in a century or two, maybe be a human again.
Ruthlessness may enrich us and make us more powerful, but we pay for it in other ways.
To be in power, you didn't need guns, or money, or even numbers. You just needed the will to do what the other guy wouldn't.
So there you have it. When you're a person, nation, or organization, if you're willing to pay the price, the key to power is to look as dangerous as possible, while only occasionally causing harm, paying your key support as well, and obtaining as much resources as possible. And when you are using force, taking out a surprised rival or owner of a valuable resource with a well-placed surprise strike to a vital spot is ideal, as this lowers the cost and risk while maximizing the cause harm, and doing whatever you can to still appear trustworthy to others at the same time, all the while presenting as little weak spots yourself and never turning your back on anyone, because you're creating the type of opposition that's unlikely to strike unless it can finish the job. However, power is not the only way to get what we want, and there are 3 fundamental alternatives displayed in Altered Carbon. We can ignore the odds and fight back regardless, trade on the basis of self-ownership, or we can form groups. It is valuable to look at what power isn't, because the quest for power is often disguised as one of its alternatives. If you look at history, you can see that those who are still in the process of building up their power often hide their intentions.
Witness the protectorate, courage of triumph.
So having a clear understanding of what power is not helps to distinguish disguised power from its alternatives. The first alternative is just to never back down. Power works because the weakest side of a conflict generally wants to avoid that conflict. Apart from a bit of token resistance, it will be okay with the strongest side winning by default. But this preserves the strongest side's resources and can use those to extort other weaker parties. However, if you're willing to fight a losing battle, you might be able to make the stronger party fight the costly one. Even if the stronger party's win is basically guaranteed, the cost might outweigh the benefits to such an extent it isn't worth it for them. This is why burning bridges can be an effective deterrent. It communicates something along the lines of, we are going to fight with all we have, because we have no choice now. We may very well lose, but we are going to make you pay as much as we can for your victory. So choose wisely. Fighting back regardless works best if the weaker party is at least somewhat close in their resources and capacity to harm and has combat experience. as it can be terrifying to stand up to a significantly stronger opponent. But if enough entities refuse to give in to the powerful, no matter what, power starts becoming more trouble than it is worth.
And ultimately, the truth sinks in that no matter what justification you're selling yourself, this is not about terrorism. Terrorism is the excuse. This is about economic and social control. And the only thing you're really protecting is the supremacy of your government.
The other two alternatives to power focus more on cooperation. To trade is simple. Rather than force someone to do something, we could try to convince the other that what you want them to do is in line with their own self-interest, and then allow them to make up their own mind. And the show offers a wide variety of harm and threat-free transactions that get both parties what they want. This is of course most effective if both sides can offer something the other desires. It is the basic principle of commerce, and for a nation or organization to keep on functioning, it has to pay its employees a reasonable wage. The possibility of rejection might be bigger, and the deals may not be as sweet as when you come from a clear position of power, but it doesn't breed resentment, and if you make a reasonable enough offer, there are generally some people who take you up on it. The approach of free exchange only works when both parties honor the other's sovereignty and allow each other to make up their own mind. Lies and false advertising interfere with this ability and therefore give power to the seller. But because they fundamentally undermine the self-ownership of the buyer, lies generally erode trust and damage the seller's reputation.
No. Stop trying to unload your old inventory and show us the good stuff.
This doesn't mean that one side of the trade can't act in a more respectful or even subservient manner, as long as both sides are free to choose. The customer might well be required to pay more money just for the added aesthetic of an elevated position. The fundamental disadvantage of self-ownership, though, is that you're still alone and vulnerable to those who don't respect self-ownership.
For those of us climbing to the top of the food chain, there can be no mercy. There is but one rule: hunt or be hunted.
This brings us to the other alternatives to power. We can form an us from two-person relationships to massive nations and support each other. Apart from fulfilling our need for human connection, it also allows us to share resources and work together. As humans, we have a tendency to group up when we're faced with a dangerous enemy, who doesn't want to let the members make their own choices. In those cases, we're more likely to work together, share information, and start thinking of ourselves as an us.
This fight is not just yours anymore.
You can hear the word selection of the people around you change when this is happening. Even when it's just a symbolic battle, like a sports match where national teams play each other. Working together might be enough to tip the balance of power, and it might not be, but at least we're in it together. So, even as an us, the underdog may still play along to avoid conflict. But in the meantime, those who feel oppressed continue to relate strongly with one another. Of course, we also do it because we appreciate the other's company. We form relationships without any kind of outside pressure to. But a shared enemy, injustice or threat does seem to facilitate the process and tends to increase how important the oppressed group we belong to is to us. The main factor in forming some sort of relationship seems to be trust. After watching the show a few times, I started to see more and more examples in which trust or the lack of it played an important role. And it makes sense. As much as being part of a tight group may protect us, we are also exposing ourselves to other members of the group.
We have ruined each other, haven't we?
The closer we are to someone, the more they're capable of harming us, and the more capable we are of harming them. but we choose to trust they will not intentionally harm us, and we can demonstrate our trustworthiness in turn. A smaller group is of course more intimate, but even on the national level, a base level of trust and an us experience among its citizens is important to maintain stability. This trust that relationships are built on seems to be fundamentally based on two main factors. The first is that we do not use harm to get others to do what we want. The second is that we act on a shared principle or set of them. Let's start with the lack of harm in relationships. We can disagree, but in the end, we let the other make their own choices. Of course, we are human, and it is easy to raise a voice, be an ass, or make a threat when things get heated. But if the break wasn't too fundamental, we can generally restore trust over time with a genuine apology. We show we understand why we acted untrustworthy and make ourselves vulnerable to the ones we wronged. By doing so, we give the other the ability to harm us and demonstrate our willingness to trust they will not do so.
You can use it to bash my face in if you want. Or take a family bulk deal.
Don't tempt me.
But in general, in a healthy us, the idea of consciously and consistently using harm to get our way is so unthinkable it almost becomes humorous.
Don't tempt me.
This is why it is so important that children are brought up in safe environments, where they can learn to trust others, and as they grow older, slowly learn to take part in the collective decision-making process and form relationships. If not, they may never learn to truly connect with others, and at best learn to present the veneer of cooperation, while resorting to harm or the threat of it whenever it suits them.
You have a gift. You have power. And with great power, there must also come great responsibility.
The other factor to building in us is discovering which values we share and putting them above our own self-interest. Shared values help synchronize our actions, shape the shared decision-making process, and build trust. Apart from not hurting each other, we may, for example, agree on a common goal, some shared ideal, a shared love, or a shared enemy. We might even expect a certain standard of behavior of in-group members and call each other out on their behavior when someone does live up to it.
Have you always been such an asshole?
On a national level, a state can build trust to its citizens by upholding the rule of law unconditionally or by consistently acting on some other set of values. Because people in a healthy relationship can't have power over each other, they can only try to influence the group's actions by communicating with others. This is why we see people who are part of the same entity consistently negotiate about their values and reality more general. On a side note, it is fascinating how we continuously create our shared reality by talking about it. What's worth noticing? What is normal and acceptable to us? Is something right or wrong? Who is responsible for something? And who deserves what? Sometimes we discuss this directly, but more often than not, we just imply it. In this way, we are co-creating reality with every conversation. But this probably deserves its own musing one day. So back to the topic at hand. Like with power, trust is also no guarantee people stay loyal to each other. But it works a little differently. Honoring the principle of self-ownership means accepting the fact that there are sometimes conflicting or even irreconcilable priorities. Or maybe it just doesn't work anymore. But where this is a flaw in regards to power, it is a feature of relationships. Being in any type of healthy relationship means you consistently choose to be together and allow your partner the option to leave you, because that is the only way for your partner to truly choose to be with you. A breakup can still be very emotional and very painful, but this is partly because whatever the flaws in the relationship, you both lose something that can't be taken by force or bought.
A man commits a crime, he should know better. We have him killed and we feel pretty good about it. Or we kill him ourselves and we feel even better. That's not power, though. That's justice. It's different than power. Power is when we have every justification to kill. And we don't.
Now that we've discussed most aspects of power in broad strokes, I feel like we do need to add a little bit of nuance. It unfortunately isn't all as simple as power is bad, just trust each other. It's complex. Although the underlying principles of harm and trust are fundamentally opposed, in practice we tend to form intricate webs of connection on many different levels. We humans are both individuals and part of groups, relationships, and nations all at the same time, and some of those revolve more around power and harm than others. The group of main characters itself may be built on trust, but on another level, this group does harm and bring down a powerful individual who is actively harming members of the group. Relationships are seldom 100% based on trust or 100% on power, nor is this split static. Even someone extremely powerful can build trust by consistently self-restricting on the basis of principles. Bancroft honors his promise to the main character, despite it being the vastly more costly option. A cartoonish villain may dispose of his lackeys as readily as his enemies, but if any entity wants to retain a workforce in the real world, it should at least inspire a base level of trust in its key employees. Besides, even if some entity genuinely decides to start acting on the basis of trust and cooperation, others might perceive its actions as a usual front disguising the quest for power. Because of this, rebuilding trust takes time. One has to show its trustworthiness time and time again. And even if this happens, who knows? Maybe new leadership that has taken up office in this trust building period might see the trust that has been built up just as a valuable resource in the quest for power. The past provides plenty of solid reasons to distrust each other. Or consider, for example, a piece of new technology that the government deems classified, because its enemies could use it as a very effective weapon against its population. But classifying this information might also inhibit the ability of its citizens to make their own choices about how the government should and shouldn't use it. This could damage their relationship with the nation, when it eventually becomes common knowledge. And although the circle of violence is a common expression, open conflict might also lead to a sharp decline in harm and violence, rather than an increase. The police taking down a serial killer might be an example that few would object to, but a clear victory in a war or a more local conflict might herald a peaceful period after a long time of unruliness. Either because a power-hungry party is removed, it is now clear to everyone who has the biggest capacity to harm, or the war just made it abundantly clear to everyone what the cost of conflict is for a long time. It is all just not that simple. Still, the fundamental question remains: are you generally willing to harm others for personal benefit, or do you consistently place certain principles above your self-interest? We can make mistakes when emotions run high, but in the end, this is an important question we have to ask ourselves as nations, organizations, and individuals.
No one has that kind of power.
Power is a matter of influence, Mr. Kovac. And I have had a great deal of influence at the UN.
Finally, I have to make a quick distinction between power and influence, as they are sometimes used interchangeably. When I talk about power, I talk about the ability to get others to do what you want, even if they would like to do something else. So power is especially relevant in a situation with opposing intentions. Influence, on the other hand, also known as soft power, could be described as the ability to affect the behavior of others without forcing them to do anything. A bad speaker, for example, tends to be less influential than a good speaker. The good speaker generally draws bigger crowds, gets the crowd to pay more attention, and tends to convince a bigger portion of his crowd of his point of view. But every listener is still completely free to ignore the speaker and make up their own mind. So although influence and power both facilitate your impact, they're fundamentally different concepts and work in different ways. Power is the more dramatic concept in nature, but how influence or soft power works exactly might be an interesting topic for a musing one day as well. All in all, power is a fascinating concept. Like sheets of ice in Antarctica, power structures are created, reinforced, and eroded continuously. Their perceived permanence is just an illusion, as much a function of how we think as power itself. Although one's power may not be a certainty, power itself has always been around us. From the moment our species dawned, individual members and groups have had the option to cooperate with, ignore, or try to lord over others. Power may have been bought at a high price at times, but at the same time, it also prevented countless deaths in all conflicts that were never actually fought out because the probable loser decided it wasn't worth it and gave in. What stood out the most to me when I really started to think about it was to what extent trust and power were opposed forces. Learning next generations to genuinely build trust and cooperate with people who seem different to them will be important if we want to solve problems on a global level as a group, rather than having individuals, groups and nations utilizing their capacity to harm, to bully each other in endless cycles of violence, to get their way for a while on issues that ultimately don't really matter.
Saruman believes that it is only great power that can hold evil in check. But that is not what I have found. I found it is the small things, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keeps the darkness at bay. Simple acts of kindness and love.
Thank you so much for watching this first video about power. It's been both challenging and a lot of fun to create. I've been playing around with this topic for quite a while now, and although I really appreciated the feedback I got from friends on some earlier attempts, at some point I just wanted to finish a couple of videos, to really create something, and take it from there. If I'm being completely honest, I still think that some parts can be a little too dry. I definitely mispronounced or rushed a couple of words, and some alineas could have been written better. Still, I'm proud of the result, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll try to make the next one even better. At the moment, I'm working on a video about the power of stories, and one about putting the principles of power into practice. But how do you see power? Are there aspects of it that I missed? Can you perhaps think of a topic that could use a new perspective? Or how can I make these videos better? Or can you think of a fitting catchphrase I can end them with? Please let me know in the comments.